This week is the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Sukkot. Those are all the same name for the same event, holy season for our Jewish friends. And later this week, you'll be able to, I assume they'll do it this year, you'll be able to go over there and by the Jewish Community Center and see what they set up as their tabernacle. And we will be looking at this feast and describing a little bit from the Old Testament and showing how it does relate to prophecy. I'm going to read, this is from the King James. If you want to read Leviticus 23:33 through 34 in your version, you feel free to, but I'm going to read it in the King James, and it's on the screen if you want to follow along that way. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. On the first day shall be an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein. 7 days ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And on the 8th day shall be an holy convocation unto you. And ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly, and ye shall do no servile work therein. These are the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering, and a meat offering, a sacrifice, and drink offerings, everything upon his day. Beside the Sabbaths of the Lord, and beside your gifts, and beside all your vows, and beside all your freewill offerings, which ye give unto the Lord. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when ye have gathered in the fruit of the land, ye shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. And ye shall take on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of thick trees, and willows of the brook. And ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And ye shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute for you forever in your generations. Ye shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Now, 2 or 3 times in there it talks about the 15th day of the 7th month. Well, we're already in the 10th month, aren't we? That's because the Jewish calendar is a Hebrew calendar. It's a lunar calendar that does not follow our Gregorian calendar that we follow. But what is interesting this year is that how close to the same dates we are in the month, because this starts on the 16th, but the 16th technically starts on the evening of the 15th. And this says on the 15th of the month. So it will be starting Wednesday evening, and I'm not sure exactly when they will be building the little tabernacle over here, but it's interesting to watch, and they have their kids do it. I told you last week I saw them standing outside waiting in line to go into Sunday school. We always tend to think, well, they do their thing on Saturday, don't they? Well, they have a holy day on Saturday, but the Jews have a Sunday school. They really do. Verse 42, Ye shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born shall dwell in booths. If you're an Israelite, if you're a Jew, you're supposed to build one of these temporary shelters. The Hebrew word Sukkot. You're supposed to build this once every year in the fall. And why do you do that? So that your generations may know that I have made children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And Moses declared unto the children of Israel the feast of the Lord. This is the final feast, and that closing verse there closes out all 7 feasts that are described in the book of Leviticus in chapter 23. But I want you to catch that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The whole purpose of this feast is for the Israelites to be reminded that they were a people in a foreign land and God brought them out, and He did not allow them into the promised land for 40 years, and they wandered that desert all that time. And we're going to be seeing a little bit more about that later. They call these little tabernacles, they call it a Sukkot. Now, what is the definition of Sukkot? Don't worry about that little bitty line that popped up there. That's the Hebrew. We're not learning Hebrew today. But this word is the feminine word of another word that means hut or lair. That 5520 refers to, well, if you see the little one, it's 5521. Those are Strong's numbers. And that 21 is just the female version, the feminine version of 5520, which is the masculine version of the same word, and it means hut or lair. It also means a booth. It gets interpreted as a booth, a cottage, a covert, a pavilion, a tabernacle, or a tent. We tend to think of tabernacle or tent because that's the way the King James interpreted most of these incidents of the word Sukkot in the King James Version. So that's why we call it the Feast of Tabernacles. But they lived in tents. They lived in movable shelters for that 40 years. And that word is also related to a primitive word that means properly to entwine as a screen, by implication to fence in, to cover over, and figuratively it means to protect. It's cover, defense, defend, hedge in, join together. There's an interesting one, little variation on that word, to join together, to set and to shut up, to give protection. What do we want to do in the wintertime? We want to close up the doors and the windows and have that protection from the cold. Now, let's talk about the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths or the Feast of Sukkot as the Jewish people related. As I said, Sukkot is a hut, a lair, a booth, cottage, tabernacle, tent, entwined by screen, cover over. Now that screen, that has a meaning there. There's a reason they use that. Because you remember when we read in the passage, it said to bring the branches from all the different kinds of trees. This is not to be a solid structure. And in some parts of the world, they've changed this to just the roof part of the tabernacle. It's not to be a solid material because you're supposed to be able to see the sunlight coming through, and you're supposed to be able to see the stars and the moonlight coming through at nighttime also. And if you can't see that, your covering and your protection is too solid. Now, I know that in places like New York, the Jews there, they will have plywood sides because they get really cold up there this time of the year. And even with the solid sides, they will have some type of top that will allow the sunlight and the stars to shine through where they can see them at night. And part of that is because, if you live out in the country, you know this, but if you're in here in town, you don't know it so much. When you go outside at night and there's no light pollution, the stars at night are super bright, they're super clear, and it's absolutely beautiful. You just cannot look up and see those stars and not believe there's a God that created those. There's no way you can humanly do it. If you are, you have disconnected from reality far too much. The first day is a Sabbath. It doesn't matter what the first day is. It doesn't fall on Saturday every year. It is a Sabbath. They treat it just like they would any Sabbath. They do no manual labor. They're very reserved in what amount of work they are allowed to do. And they have a holy assembly. Now, I don't recall seeing them assemble over here in the past few years, but maybe since COVID is far enough in the past, maybe they will have an assembly over here. They did have an assembly yesterday. Yesterday was the feast we talked about last Sunday, the Feast of Sanctification, where they come together to make themselves right before God. They have this for 7 days, and they present burnt offerings. That was when there was a temple in Jerusalem. They do not do sacrifices right now because, except for a few that still sacrifice chickens, but in general, they do not offer sacrifices, and they certainly don't do it every single day right now because they don't have the temple where these sacrifices would have been performed. Then it mentions an 8th day. That's one little caveat in the thing that it doesn't get talked about a lot. It's a day of a holy assembly and a burnt offering and a Sabbath. All things are supposed to happen on the 8th day. It kept talking about 7 days, and then just one little brief mention of an 8th day, and I think that's important. And I'll explain that before we get to the end of the sermon. Now, there are regulations for Sukkot that they are supposed to follow. And all these, in addition to the no work and the holy assembly, they're to bring grain offerings, sacrifice. Sacrifice means some animal has to die. Drink offering. You have to bring wine. Why would they be bringing wine? Because that's what they drank back then. Yes, it might have gotten mixed with water, but it wasn't alcoholic wine. Why did they do that? Because it was a way of preserving the juice. You can't let juice just sit out under natural conditions and it stay good. It will go bad. But if you ferment it properly, it will turn into wine, and it can be stored and kept all year long and be safe to drink. And they didn't do all of these things every day. They had assigned days. There were certain days for grain offerings, certain days to sacrifice, and certain days for the drink offering. And there was a special order for that, and we're not going into all that. They were to bring gifts and vow. Vow. Commitments to God. Commitment to the law. Commitment that would be honoring to God. And voluntary offering. We tend to talk about paying our tithes, don't we? And we think the tithe is 10%. But if you take the Old Testament rules and laws, it ends up being about 30% of your total income. We don't preach that a whole lot in the New Testament church, do we? That's what the Old Testament teaches. And on top of that, there's voluntary offering. So they were giving well in excess of 30% of their annual increase. I'm not going to say income, I'm going to say increase, because they weren't necessarily a monetary economy at that point when this was set up. It was more agrarian. This festival is also called a festival of the Lord. If you go back and read in verse 39, it states a festival of the Lord. A time of being with the Lord is what it's actually saying there. So they are remembering back to the time of coming out of Egypt. They're traveling around in tents, and how are they guided? Guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And what do those clouds and pillars represent? Represented God, didn't it? And that was with them 24 hours a day, all the way through until they were able to go into the promised land. They were to celebrate in the presence of the Lord, influence construction of the booths. Celebrate in the presence of the Lord influences the construction of the booths. You see, these temporary shelters didn't now offer a whole lot of protection, did they? I know for a fact that living in that parsonage over there is much nicer than trying to stay in a tent for a long period of time. Yes, I love to go camping and sleep in a tent, but I don't like to do it for more than a few days. Why? Because weather, cold, heat, bugs, tents don't provide the same protection that we're used to as Americans, do they? And once they moved into Israel, there were already houses set up. They took over, and God wanted them to be reminded that, hey, I gave you this protection all these years. It was 40 years they were in that desert, and God's protection was with them. So they're celebrating in the presence of the Lord this week. That's the way they see it. Now, they were to bring branches from palm trees. Why palm trees? Because that's what's in the area. They had palm trees in the area. It'd be hard for us to bring palm branches, wouldn't it? We'd have to travel quite a distance, wouldn't we? The Jews who build shelters now won't be using palm branches over here across the street. The one year I helped them over there, it was like weeds out of the field. Willow trees. Now, we have willow trees. Very thin, wispy leaves. They're almost not even really leaves, are they? They're very different, unique structures on those trees. And then it says thick trees. Thick trees. What do you mean by thick trees? It's actually talking about broadleaf trees that are full of leaves and provide a lot more protection when you have a layer over the top of your structure, or even use it on the sides. It's more substantial than palm leaves and willow leaves. Interesting point here. These same types of trees are described as where the pagans worshiped. They worshiped under thick trees. You can read that in Ezekiel 6:13, and that's supposed to be verses 20 and 28. Should have been a comma there instead of a colon, but it should have been 6:13 through 20 and verse 28. But anyway, the pagans were worshiping under these trees. Now, why would they be under these trees? For the thick protection. You see, the pagan worshipers, especially when they start out, they like cover. They don't like the light to come in. And the thick trees provided that cover. And they would build fires and stuff, but it would be hard to be seen from a distance because of the thick trees. It is a forever festival, reminding them of the 40 years of wandering. What do I mean by a forever festival? Not that it goes on year round, but that it happens every year. Here we are, 4,000 years removed from the Exodus. And the Jews today still celebrate, still build these tabernacles, still worship God specifically for that week. 4,000 years later and they're still doing it. That's a long time. That's a long time. God was physically with them, not in body, but in a cloud and as a pillar of fire at night. That was God representing himself here on this earth for those 40 years, and he was with them at all times. When the cloud or the pillar of fire would move, they would move. When the cloud or the pillar of fire would stop, they would stop and set up camp. Can you imagine having to pack up everything you own and moving just because the cloud moved? Wow. Can't imagine. But God was with them at all times, and they knew that if they got away from God, they would no longer have his protection. During this time, God provided their food. He provided their food for 40 years. When they first left, they were to take bread without yeast. Why were they using bread without yeast? Because this happened at Passover. The Exodus happened during the week of Passover. That's what established the week of Passover. And the only thing they could take with them would be their animals and their bread. Well, eating just bread all the time was going to get old. So they complained, and what did God do? God says, you'll go out into the fields and find something. You remember what it's called? They called it manna. And we don't really know what manna is. We have no clue what it is. It's something that God provided. They think it's thin white wafers that might taste like honey. That's the closest guess that they can give us, is that their food was something thin and white that may have tasted like honey. And they were each family was to gather. And they were only to gather as much as they could eat that day and no more. If they tried to gather more and save it, what happened? It rotted and stank. And then after a certain amount of time, they grew weary of just having manna all the time. So God says, okay, I will give you meat. And what happened? They had to go out and collect daily birds that fell out of the sky. I've never had a deer or a turkey or anything run up beside me and just die and carry it home. I've had to work really hard to obtain these animals to bring home to eat. God provided these animals for these people. You know, if something just dies right in front of us, we don't eat it, do we? Exactly. We wouldn't trust it. But these people had to trust God because He told them it would be there, and it was there. And again, they were only supposed to get as much as they could eat and not too much. Now, on what we call Friday, they were to gather twice as much because that day's manna would carry over into the Sabbath. Why would He do that? Because they're not supposed to do the work on the Sabbath. So God was providing in multiple ways, and if you didn't listen, you reaped the benefit, the reward, I guess you should say, of having stench and stink where you keep your food, because it would rot if you collected too much on a regular day. Yeah, clean your plate. Oh, that's funny, John. That's funny. Their clothes lasted for 40 years. There's an overlooked statement. Their clothes lasted for 40 years. Now, this suit I'm wearing come from the Goodwill. But based on the texture and wherever, the way it's made and the way it feels, it may be 40 plus years old. But I didn't have it all that time. I just bought it a couple of years ago for a picture. And it was too small then, but now it fits. So God provided me with something that I didn't know I was going to be using on a regular basis. But their clothes lasted for 40 years. They didn't have a closet full of clothes. We're used to, we have to have a closet, we have to have a chest of drawers, a dresser, and all this place to store our clothes. We have winter clothes, we have summer clothes, we have clothes for certain occasions. They didn't have that. One, maybe two sets of clothes at most. So when they packed up, they didn't have as much to pack up as we would. But they still had to pack everything they owned and move whenever God told them to. Now, this forever festival was to remind them of the 40 years, and their feet never swell. Wandering around in the desert, and your feet never swell up. Wouldn't that be nice? Feet never hurt. I'm reminded on a regular basis that I don't have this particular blessing that the Israelites had. They traveled or camped at God's direction. They stopped and went, listening for 40 years to what God told them to do. Do we do that? Do we listen daily to God's direction? We make plans, don't we? We put it on a calendar. My cell phone has a calendar right on it. It tells me every day what if I have to do that day. Hard to listen to God when we're focusing on the things here on earth, aren't we? We need to be thinking about that. Now let's compare this to the millennial reign of Christ that's seen in Revelation that we went through a while back. Jesus will be physically with them at all times. You can read that in Daniel 7:14. Daniel 7:14 tells us Jesus will be with them at all times. They will have food security. Isaiah 65:21 and 22 talks about how the food will be there for the people living during the millennial reign of Jesus Christ here on this earth. They will have housing security. Isaiah 65:21 and 22 also talk about the housing. Talk about houses that you didn't build. Just like when they moved into the promised land initially, they moved into houses that were already set up. There were olive trees, there were grapevines, there were fig trees. All their food was already there. All they had to do was move in and start living in the city, and it will be like that for 1,000 years in Israel. They will have health security. Isaiah 65:20 talks about if you don't live to be 100 years old, you will be considered a cursed person. If that was the case right now, we're all just about cursed, aren't we? Not many of us live to be 100 at this point. There's more and more all the time, it seems like. I don't know if it really is more, if it gets promoted more. But very rare do people live to be 100. It will be the norm in the 1,000-year reign. You'll be considered cursed if you don't live to be at least 100, according to 65:20 of Isaiah. And in a side-by-side comparison of these verses I just gave you, the final fall festival directly indicates what will be happening in the millennial reign.